I've watched the discussions, and I've listened to the testimony on Tuesday with regard to what the bank does and the fact that literally there are all of our competitive nations that we work with have an entity similar to the bank that their businesses can rely on in order to compete. And so it seemed strange to me that we would have the challenges that we've heard with regard to the renewal of your ability to continue forward. And I've tried to search and figure out what it is that's causing the uproar. And I want to try to get to what I think might be part of it. And so I want to ask you some questions here, and I mean this to try to give you the opportunity to explain it. And Mr. Chairman, I apologize. I was in the chair, so I wasn't able to hear what the other testimony was earlier. But thank you, sir. But what I'd like to do is just ask a question and then work our way through this and give you the opportunity to respond, sir, as president of the bank. I understand that the bank is part of the federal government and that as a result there are rules and regulations that they have to abide by. But I'm concerned when I see that you as the head of the bank have been making some rather significant political statements that I think may have caused part of the problem. It only bolsters a concern that the bank is picking winners and losers. Here's the example that I'm speaking of. In 2013, you said, and I quote, "The bank engages in an important balancing act. In supporting our exporters, we have to weigh the potential impacts on the environment associated with our financing. Without guidelines or limits, ever-increasing numbers of new coal plants worldwide will just continue to emit more carbon pollution into the air we breathe. But America cannot do this alone. I strongly support the administration's efforts to build an international consensus such that other nations follow our lead in restricting financing of new coal-fired power plants." End of quote. Mr. President, what you call carbon pollution powers a lot of the homes in my home state of South Dakota and used for a lot of power on the farms in our part of the country as well. I'm concerned that by using what literally is a loaded carbon pollution and making personal statements about which types of exports that you may oppose, the Ex-Im Bank becomes more about advancing policy goals and less about creating American jobs. Do you think that making this statement was a mistake and gives the opponents of the Ex-Im Bank the ammunition to say that Ex-Im does pick winners and losers?
Well, Senator, thank you for giving me a chance to talk about this. I'm glad we had a chance to meet in your office. I mentioned earlier, we've had an environmental policy that Congress has inserted in our charter since 1992. For over 2 decades, we have been required to look at reasonable assurance repayment and the environmental impact. That's not my doing. That's been in our charter for over 2 decades. I mentioned earlier, and in the first part of, under the Bush administration, in the 2004, 5, 6 range, well before I got to the bank got sued, and before I got to the bank agreed to a consent decree of how to impact, how the bank could do a better job to adhere to the will of Congress, which is to take the environment into account. So the bank's been doing this, and it's been an evolving policy over the last 2 decades. So this is not something that I inserted into, it's not a personal agenda.
Can you show me any place where the Congress of the United States has identified carbon pollution as being part of your role in terms of managing the environment?
Well, the environment was put in, as I said, happy to share with you the lawsuit that the bank lost because the court found that the bank, before I got there, was not taking into account the environment sufficiently. And part of that agreement was some restrictions, some regulation on the amount of carbon. So that precedes me at the bank.
I understand that you have an obligation in which you can and are required or expected to promote renewable energy. But I can't find where you are in a position to determine, and I'm just going to ask a question. If an organization walks in and they say, look, we've got an opportunity to create and to build a new power plant, is it your role to then say, well, is this a coal-fired plant, and if it is, it's not something that we can do?
No, we don't look at a coal-fired, that's not the issue. We look at the environmental impact, and we look at the amount of high carbon intensity. It's not about for coal or against coal. We, in fact, Senator, we export coal. We export coal mining equipment. The only thing we've had to do, and again, it's part of a consent decree, is to look at to what degree the environment's impacted by our export. That's what was put in by Congress. And again, the Ex-Im Bank lost a lawsuit about that. I'd be happy to share with you the section of the law, and I'm happy to share with you the consent decree.
Mr. President, I think what happens in this particular case is it gives those individuals who have a concern about whether or not you're picking winners and losers, and you shouldn't be picking winners and losers. I think it gives them the opportunity to point to the fact that in this particular case, when it comes to your statements on power plants that are coal-fired, that you do have a desire or an interest in promoting those which are not coal-fired. And I bring it up because I think it's got to be clarified that either you are picking winners and losers and giving people who do not want to see this bank continue forward, you're giving them the ammo that they want to show that you are picking winners and losers, and that's not the way that it was set up in their opinion, nor in my opinion. And but I wanted to give you the opportunity to try to correct anything if we're misunderstanding the focus that you think the bank has got.
I guess all I can say is that we're doing to the best of our ability to follow the will of Congress in terms of taking the environment into account.
And so what I understand is that you believe that it is the will of Congress that we not promote, as you call it, carbon pollution through the creation of coal-fired plants or the use of the bank to finance coal-fired plants in other parts of the world.
Well, we are open for coal-fired power plants in the 80 or 82 poorest countries in the world. That's the only what our current law states is that.
So you would do it in 80 or 82
they're called IDA or IDA blend, but defined by the World Bank. Those we do not have restrictions at all. In wealthier countries, countries that have options on renewable gas, nuclear, the current policy, and in our appropriation bill, says that we don't do any coal-fired power plants in those countries where they have a lot of options. Poorer countries, 80 countries in the world approximately today,
is that directed by Congress, or is that a policy which has been created within the bank itself?
No, that's in our current appropriation language.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Appreciate your comments.